Hi, everybody. You'll be watching this before our first class tomorrow or later today, depending on when you're watching this. And I'll talk a little bit more about the new normal going forward, but suffice to say, I'm sorry. This is a bummer, and it's going to be hard in a lot of ways. But I also think hopefully we can all make the most of it, and I'm certainly going to do my part to create a learning experience for y'all that is enjoyable and stimulating. I hope so. Anyway, that's what I'm trying to do. We're gonna be doing this project where you're gonna be able to pick a topic that you find interesting, and ultimately try to create something to teach other people about some topic related to America at war in the 20th century. I'm finishing up here what I was starting to do before the break, which is talking about like an overview of each of the major wars: World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, to give you all like a general kind of 10,000-foot overview of these things before you dive in on a particular project. Where we left off before the break was that you had learned about World War I, and you learned about the outbreak of World War II up to Pearl Harbor, and then in fifth hour you learned about Rosa the Riveter and women in the workforce, and seventh hour you learned about Japanese internment, but not really the body of the war. And so I'm gonna kind of finish talking about World War II in this video. The first thing I want to mention is about something you could do a project on, is you don't have to write about the war itself to create something about the war itself. You could create something about the home front. People living at home were nevertheless quite affected by the war. And, maybe you're tired of hearing about the coronavirus, but I think, a decent parallel to what we're going through right now is World War II. Now, to be clear, there's tons and tons of differences, but in terms of just everyday life being fundamentally different, right? You can really see that in World War II. That's a project you could do, is how things were different for ordinary people, even those who didn't join the fight. One way that the home front changed is that there was a big surge in wartime production, that the American economy had to basically retool itself in order to fight this big war. And this indeed was actually a major advantage that Americans had over other countries. We could just outproduce them. I'd say it's the secret sauce in American military victory in World War II. By 1944, I think the stat is we were producing twice as much industrially as Germany and Japan combined, right? So, you could write about that change in the economy and the role the government played in it. Another thing you could do a project on is Rosa the Riveter. Fifth hour people heard a lot from Saul about this, but basically women entering the workforce in large numbers, the impact it had on them, American attitudes towards this shift. And, we see this iconic picture of Rosa the Riveter. You might be more familiar with a different one, actually, but this is the one that would have been most familiar to people living at the time. You can notice this woman who's dressed in, working class garb. She's in denim. She has a riveting gun in her lap. She is pretty buff. If you look at her upper arms, this image of women entering a sphere that's traditionally men's. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there if you want to do a project on that. Another potential project you could do about the home front would be about the Second Great Migration. Just as you need industrial workers, and so more and more women do it. A lot of Black folks moved from the South to the North to be industrial workers, just as was true in World War I. And they settle in northern cities, and so that story of Black folks moving north and settling in this new environment could be a project. And like we saw in World War I with those riots of 1919, there's racial tensions that go along. There's I think in Detroit, a really big race riot in 1943. And so you could tell the sort of, the tensions that arose from this as well. Anyway, so the last thing that I wanted to mention in terms of the home front is something called the Zoot Suit riots, which would be like a super interesting topic to do. The Zoot Suit was a fashion thing that came out of the Chicano community, Mexican-American community, and eventually spread to lots of places, but it's this kind of rebellious youth fashion. You can see the baggy pants and the long jackets going down. This is associated with a sort of, rebellious counterculture. And during the war, these long these long suits were using a lot of fabric, and that was something that was another source of resentment, that people, that these teenagers and these youth were wearing this stuff with all this fabric that we needed for the war. And then there was this kind of these white Mexican tensions in Los Angeles that already existed. And there are these Zoot Suit riots where basically American sailors end up attacking a lot of these Mexican American folks wearing the Zoot Suits. And I think it's a really interesting way to look at the role of race and ethnicity and some of the tensions that emerged during World War II. So those are some of the homefront stories you can do. Another big homefront story that you could do would have to do with civil liberties. Now, remember, we talked about civil liberties in World War I. We had the Anti-Sedition Acts and the Espionage Acts that were, pretty strict about what you couldn't say. In terms of dissent, World War II was a more tolerant environment in terms of what the government was doing to crack down on it. Basically, there weren't these kind of harsh laws passed by the government that says you couldn't criticize the war effort. To be honest, the war was more popular anyway, so they were less necessary. And to be sure, the US government did try to influence the press in various ways and Hollywood in various ways, but they didn't have these strict rules. And in that respect, World War II is less of a civil libertarian's nightmare than World War I. That said, to act as if everything was cool in the home front for people who were criticizing the war effort, this leaves out a very big thing, which is that in terms of the enemy within, Japanese internment was an enormously huge breach of civil liberties during wartime. And in 7th hour, you learned a lot about this. And even if you're in 5th hour, this is something you can do a project on. So I'm not going to dwell, but basically, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there's this sense held by a lot of white folks at the time that we couldn't trust the Japanese people. They could be enemy agents in our midst. Even ones that were born in the United States were not reliably pro-American, and therefore they needed to be interned. And something like 110,000 Japanese people of Japanese descent were ultimately put in camps. 2/3 of them were citizens, were born in the United States. Nevertheless, they were considered of suspect loyalty and interned. Some of you looked at some of those cartoons if you were in 7th hour. Generally, when they were rounded up, they were more or less acquiescent. They did not try to fight it. One of the big reasons is they were trying to prove their loyalty, that you could trust us, and so fighting back would have been bad. You could see the sort of subtle ways you could make a point while being interned. Here is someone being interned, and you can see what he is wearing. That's a World War I U.S. Army uniform, and so you can see the sort of the cutting points he's making by dressing up that way when he's gathered up to be interned. If you do this project, you can talk about life in these massive internment camps and what it was like. People spent years in these internment camps. Interestingly, the army age people were ultimately recruited and ended up fighting in the war. So you could have people fighting in World War II while their parents were in internment camps. And so that's a project that you could choose to do, is talk about the experience, the decision to intern, and the experience of people once they are interned. You might be hearing Thea right now, so I have to go and tend to him. The next thing I want to talk about is propaganda, and this is another project you can do. Once again, I don't want to dwell on it since this is something you could all dig much deeper into, but suffice to say, there are several functions that propaganda serves during World War II. One of them is to encourage sacrifice. For example, this famous picture, this is what you probably think of as Rosie the Riveter, but actually very few people would have seen this, and this wasn't like an icon to women's empowerment during the war. This was a message to American women working in a particular factory that you can hit your production quota, and it's trying to inspire them to do that. And so again, it's not like kind of proto-feminism. What it is do your part to chip in and contribute to the war effort. And we see that throughout American culture, that message. The whole idea of women working hard in the workforce often was framed as sacrifice, as something giving up your traditional role to fulfill this role that we need during the war. Here's another example of the rhetoric of sacrifice. You can see this woman here who is a Eastern European, maybe Polish villager. Her village has been destroyed, and it's saying, we talk about sacrifice. Like, listen, this is not that bad. You can do this sacrifice. Another sacrifice being asked for here is to join a car sharing club that is the carpool. And I just like the image of Hitler peacefully sitting next to this person. It's like, well, if you are wasting gas by riding alone, you're helping Hitler, thus you ride with Hitler. And there's lots of other propaganda that's trying to encourage and inform people about what sacrifices they need to make to help the war effort. Another major theme in propaganda is demonizing the enemy. I have this quote from Variety at the time: Americans, the theory is, will be better haters and thus better fighters and workers if they're not beclouded with the false idea that the enemy is a bunch of poor, misguided people who deserve more pity than bullets and bombs. Right? It is helpful in some ways for the American war effort if people hate our enemies. And propaganda tried to achieve that goal in various ways. And one of the things you can really focus on in this project is, in particular, depiction of the Japanese. This depiction here as lice that need to be eradicated. Japanese are often depicted as vermin of some kind, and we can see that here. A trend, if you dig into it, and this is, I think, a really interesting topic, is how the Japanese were depicted versus the Germans. The Japanese were often depicted more animal-like, as you can see in this particular cartoon. We see the familiar trope that we've seen several times this year of an ape-like figure preying upon a woman. We saw it in World War I. We've seen it at other places in American history. Contrast that with the Germans, who are definitely evil, but it's a more kind of civilized evil. That is, they are, what's terrifying about them is they're ruthlessly efficient, and they're cold, and they're monstrous in terms of their morality, but not monstrous in terms of being subhuman in the way the Japanese are often depicted. In any case, there's an interesting argument that you can do there if you choose that project. So what I want to finish with is to give the short version of the military conflict of World War II and American involvement in that. Again, this is the short version. On projects, what you can do is choose some of this stuff, maybe a particular battle, maybe a particular theme, various experiences about fighting in the war, and zoom in on different parts of this. And I'll just start with the broad overview. When people talk about World War II, they often talk about two major theaters of World War II. They talk about the European theater and Pacific theater, and Americans were fighting in both places, though most Americans were fighting in the Pacific theater, fighting against the Japanese, and that's where I'll start. Sorry, I have to fix this real quick. So, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese are able to conquer a whole bunch of stuff. If you can look on this map, you can see just the, all of that area of like Southeast Asia, that archipelago off Southeast Asia that they're able to take over, as the Americans, for a brief period of time, have no navy, right? We basically are stuck with, a lot of it having been destroyed. However, we gradually rebuild that navy and are able to fight back pretty successfully and do something that eventually becomes known as island hopping. So if you can see in this map, we are going from island to island, getting closer and closer to the Japanese. In this regard, it's important that we win two decisive victories. One is at the Battle of Midway, if you've heard of Midway Airport. Another one is the Battle of Coral Sea off the coast of Australia, where we are able to really make big dents in the Japanese Navy and get these footholds in the Pacific. From there, we hop closer and closer to Japan. Basically, they had this big empire that was hard to defend, and they didn't know where we were going, and we did. And so we could, get a bunch of different ships to all go to one island and overwhelm their defenses on that island before they were ready, and gradually take over much of their empire. One of the more famous battles happens at Iwo Jima. This is the stuff of American lore. If you've ever seen that picture with all the guys raising the flag, I should have put it in the PowerPoint. But anyway, that's from Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was a particularly vicious battle because although it's a military success, it kind of speaks to how brutal this war got. There are a lot of caves on the island of Iwo Jima, and as you might have heard about the Japanese, what was typical was that they did not surrender. That's how they were trained. And therefore, before they were killed, they'd hole up in these caves, set up booby traps, try to kill as many Americans as they could before dying. Not because they planned to live, they didn't, but they were trained to kill as many Americans before they did. And therefore, Americans responded on Iwo Jima by launching these flamethrowers into the caves. And I include that detail just to give a sense of how vicious war could get during World War II. World War II is often glorified, and I think for some very good reasons in terms of defeating the Nazis, for example. But I think this was a vicious war. The way that the Japanese fought back and fought to the death convinced many Americans in policy positions that we could not afford to make a distinction between civilians and soldiers in Japan. To quote one military man, there are no civilians in Japan. And a major tactic, especially once the U.S. got close to the islands of Japan, was using airplanes to bomb Japanese cities. And this is a big part of fighting in World War II, is the bombing of opposing cities and killing civilians, not as an accident when you accidentally miss the military industrial site that you're trying to hit and you hit a few civilians. You're actually trying to kill civilians in order to help win the war faster. I forget, tens of thousands were killed in the firebombing of Tokyo, which is what you are seeing here. And of course, the most prominent example of American, killing of civilians in Japan would be the atomic bomb. So this is also something else that you could do a project on, is the development of the nuclear bomb, or the atomic bomb in this case. So if you've ever heard of the Manhattan Project, it's also something you could talk about, like the decision to use the bomb. This is basically Americans are considering whether to launch a land invasion of Japan, and ultimately you can talk about the decision by which American officials decided to use this new weapon to attack two major cities. Some of you, I hope, are familiar with the story, maybe from last year or just from before. I'll show this image briefly, just the devastating toll this had. 70,000 people in Hiroshima are killed instantly. Another 70,000 die within a year. Tens of thousands more die when we attack Nagasaki. And I'll again remind you of that line, there are no civilians in Japan. There's the sense that, the only way to crush the war effort is to take it to the civilians, and this would force them to surrender. And ultimately, after bombing both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese did surrender, ending the war in the Pacific. And certainly a good topic is exploring sort of the decision and the military ethics of using an atomic bomb. All right, I'm back and now wearing a different shirt. I had to tend to Lucy, so we didn't quite finish. Where we left off was finishing the war in the Pacific theater, and now I have some final words about the European theater. So we're kind of back in 1942. The United States is entering the war, and there's a problem in that getting into Europe is very tough. If you look at where my cursor is, the Germans control basically most of Europe, including this area here in northern France, which means it's really hard to land somewhere. And so what the American troops first try to do, if you follow my cursor, is go through North Africa. They go up through here and try to invade through the soft underbelly of the Axis powers, which is Italy. And they're able to successfully invade into Italy and eventually can get up to here before the Germans basically step in and say, all right, Italy, if you can't defend against this invasion, we will, and they take over Italy and hold it down for the rest of the war. Nevertheless, there now are American troops that can be stationed around here and then can start, my apologies, and then can start bombing German cities. And this is a crucial phase of the war where the United States, along with Britain, increasingly starts to target the German civilian population with these bombs coming from airplanes. This is something that the British were happy to start doing. They had been bombed from above by the Germans throughout the war, and so they were fine continuing to do it. There was more hesitation on the American side, but ultimately it was thought to be a military necessity. And so we see this is a scene from the bombing of Dresden, if you've ever heard of that, but again, a massive civilian death toll there. Another crucial story of why the United States was able to ultimately prevail along with the Allies has to do with what happens on the Eastern Front. So if you look at this map, you see all these red arrows and blue arrows. Follow the red arrows going out of Germany towards Russia, and you can see that there's a sustained advance on the Soviet Union by Germany. However, it did get bogged down in one of the best defenses the Russians have, which is winter. It's a vicious winter, and it was, pretty deadly for the German invading troops, and also really fierce resistance from the Russian people. And a classic example of this would be at the Battle of Stalingrad, which was this just, horrendous death toll of the Germans trying to invade the ruins of a city, basically, but invade a city and just consistent Russian fighting and just not giving in. And ultimately, as we'll see at the end of this, the death toll for the Russians is just immense, but they never give in, and they're able to eventually push the Germans back out of places like Stalingrad and push inward. And so, with the Americans starting to have successful flight campaigns against the Germans, with the Russians eventually turning the Germans around and starting to push inward, the tide is turning in the war, and the big turning point is D-Day. So if you've ever heard of this, there's this beach at Normandy where the U.S. and allied forces like the British are able to invade and finally get that foothold in Western Europe that they need to push people back. Again, the day that this push the Germans back. The day that this invasion occurs is referred to as D-Day. Certainly a project that you could do for this class could be talking about D-Day and the invasion of Normandy and the role it played in the war. If you follow the blue arrows from here, right, we have the red arrows, which are the German advances. The blue arrows are the Allied advances. And you can start to see what's happening here. After they invade Normandy, Allied troops are able to push further and further into Germany. Similarly, you can see the Soviet troops eventually starting to push into Germany. And so now the Germans are being collapsed upon by both sides. That ultimately ends in what's called VE Day. If VJ Day was victory in Japan, VE Day was victory in Europe. As you might know, Hitler commits suicide, and the war is over. Let me close with a couple of points, and I think this will be useful, especially if you choose a kind of to do a project related to the military history here. One, this is a different kind of fighting than the fighting in World War I in numerous ways. Some of the main ways, the trench warfare is just not a thing anymore, right? That was how World War I worked. You can't do it anymore, and one of the big reasons for that is tanks. The Germans pioneered tank warfare. If you remember that term, blitzkrieg, and eventually all sides are using tanks, and they could just mow through enemy lines. And so you don't have the sustained trench warfare that you had in World War I. Another big difference is we have really much wider use of airplanes while they existed in World War I, not to this extent. So we see so-called dog fights with fights between planes in the air, but you also see planes dropping bombs, and that becomes a big part of the war on all sides. And this relates to the final point that I want to make, which is World War II is really remarkable for the civilian cost. As I alluded to earlier here, it's not just that civilians died as accidental byproducts of military attacks. Deliberate matters of strategy on both sides was to attack the other side's civilians. You see, obviously, the Germans and the Japanese doing this throughout Eastern Europe or in China. We see the Allies doing it with bombing raids and so forth. And this is just kind of the immense tragedy of World War II. And if you look in this chart, the red bars represent how many soldiers died in battle, how many military deaths. And you can see, the Soviet Union always blows my mind how many, 24 million people died in the Soviet Union. But you can see what was military death toll, but also if you see the orange, that's the civilian death toll. You can see how many Soviet civilians died, how many Chinese died. If you look at Poland, plenty of those are the Jews who were killed. And just the scale, right, of that civilian death toll as a reminder of how awful this war was. To be clear, I'm someone who kind of leans pacifistic in their tendencies. I don't like war, and I often have to make an exception for World War II, right? If you look at what the Nazis were doing, it was awful, right? And in that regard, World War II strikes me as a defensible war on moral grounds, but that doesn't mean it's a glorious chapter in human history. It's arguably the deadliest chapter in human history. And if it was necessary to fight in World War II, in my opinion, it was nevertheless a brutal experience. And one that, if you're interested, you can learn more about and do a project about the way this war was fought. So I'll stop for that. We'll move on next to the Cold War, the third major war that you could do a project on in this unit, and give you that 10,000 foot view so you have the big picture and you can start thinking about what your specific projects will be. Thank you.